This is part 2 of the Southern Alberta story, late 1700s to 1874 with Dr. James Cousins.
By 1845, it was pretty well a fixed route. Dozens of people went over it. Oregon, now here's the Columbia River here. So that this gives us what is now the state of Washington, and this is the state of Oregon down here. Now this area, the whole thing, from Alaska south, was known as the Oregon Territory, and it was jointly held by the British and the Americans after a tussle with Spain, which I'm not going into at the moment. It's the Lucca Sound affair you may have heard of. If you remember the Maple Leaf Forever, you'll know that Canada extends from Cape Race to Nootka Sound, and most Canadians haven't a clue where Nootka Sound is. It's over here. Everybody thought that was going to be a great place one day, but it never got on the map. We'll have to find where it is. Now, this territory in here was operated by the Hudson Bay Company. After 1821, they took over from the Northwest Company, and they had this under control, completely under control. They had the whole area police, and according to international law, as far as they were concerned, that was British territory. And when they knew that someday they were going to have a division of it, and the British had expected that the division line would be on the Columbia River, just where Washington and Oregon are divided now. They had their Vancouver, Fort Vancouver right here, where Vancouver, Washington is today, and of course Portland, Oregon is down on the other side of the river, but it's the same city really for the boundary line. Now the American system, of course, was bring in a lot of settlers, have a democratic vote, and kick out the people who were there. And there's been a great deal of dispute over it, and this isn't our function now to go into the Oregon boundary dispute, except as it interests us. Because a lot of people came, they'd come across the United States to San Francisco, they'd come up here, they'd go through here, and some of them would follow back this way. But more people came across this way. Now, for some reason or other, I found a very curious relationship in there. When I went down to good old Yay Cougars, Washington State University, they found out I was a Canadian, and they decided that it would be nice if I could look into the aspects of racial and religious differences in the Oregon boundary dispute. So I got to be quite an authority on what happened down here. But the main thing in here is the famous Whitman saved Oregon thing. It's been exploded by American historians. Whitman never did save Oregon. But the story that he told, and he didn't tell it until about 1856, he said that he was in a room, and there were a lot of French priests in there, and the news came in from one of the priests that a great army of Canadians were being sent across country to flood Oregon, so that when they did have a vote, the Hudson Bay people would outnumber the Americans, and then the vote would go against them in favor of that foreign monopoly, as they called the Hudson Bay Company. And according to Whitman, a couple of young priests who were in the room cheered when they heard this news. Well, when the American historians began to look at it, the reason that these two young French priests didn't cheer was that there weren't any young French priests in the West at that time. And a number of other things like that. He fabricated the whole thing. But the story, the original story, is the one that I'm coming to now. The Hudson Bay Company thought, well, it would be nice if we could get some settlers in here. So they started way over here at Fort Garry, and they got James Sinclair and a group of his people, mostly half-breeds. The population was Métis or Scottish half-breed in the Red River, practically half of them. And they started out with some cows and a flock of sheep. Had a heck of a time with their sheep. And they started driving them across the prairies, and the route that they took is about the farthest south that I can find. If you've ever been through Sinclair Canyon, that's the farthest south route that anybody that I know of took in the olden days. Most of them went a little farther north. But Sinclair and his gang, sheep and all, I think he'd lost all his sheep by the time he got to Edmonton. I haven't read the story for a few years now. And on the basis of that, a few scraggly people got down here to Fort Vancouver. And then Simpson wanted them to settle in the north here, in what is now the Cowlitz Valley, and say that you settle in here. And then when they divide, see, we'll have all the British people on this side and we'll have all the American people on that side, because they were sure that the dispute was going to settle along there. And when they did get around to settling, these fellows found that there was a river down here, the Willamette, which ran through a very fertile valley, and just about everybody and his dog left Cowlitz and went down, so that the Hudson Bay Company really had nobody here to hold up their end of it. And so that when the boundary dispute came to a head in 1845, well, we'll say Canada lost. It wasn't Canada then, it was Britain. They lost out, and I never come up this coast without thinking, you know, there was going to be 54-40 or fight. They were going to fight for this territory. And then somebody told the President of the United States, well, if you go up to the 49th parallel, there's nothing more beyond that anyway. And every time I come up the coast through past Bellingham and watch how the plane disappears and the mountains come right down to the sea, I think, damn you. Look at all that nice land we should have had down there along the coast. But this is the 54-40 or fight. There's nothing, but it's interesting, though, when you do see places like Vancouver and British Columbia surviving. One of the men who was more or less kicked out was James Douglas, who came and founded a little post there, which became Victoria. And all through that period, that man was very active, very anti-American. And if we have a British Columbia today and we're proud of it, you don't have to be, you know, because they didn't vote social credit or anything. It's because of James Douglas. He was going to make sure that the Americans didn't take over his territory. Well, during this time, the British decided to send out to see if this territory could be defended from Canada. And so two explorers, War and Vavasor, came out. And they're not that important. They cursed like the rest of the fatheads. They went out here. They didn't come into our territory. But they wrote their journal, and you can have a look at that in most libraries. And at the same time, they mentioned that they met a priest who was coming up through this territory. And the priest wondered what they, British soldiers, were doing there. And the British soldiers wondered what he, an American priest, was doing there. And people have often had the suspicion that Jean-Pierre de Smet, the Belgian Jesuit, was a pro-American, and that he was up on a spying mission for the United States. He's never admitted this in any of his works. But War and Vavasor were pretty sure that that's what he was doing. And that's the man I want to come to now then, is de Smet, because he came here. Now, he was over here, where is British Columbia? I kind of lost him there in my 49. On the Tobacco Plain, right? You know, this is just south of the border. And his Indians, he had a mission to the Kootenays in there, the Katanahaw Fidler. And they had a battle with the, this is what de Smet said, with the Blackfeet, and they had practically been destroyed, and were so terrified that the Blackfeet were coming to them that they were scared to move from their lodges. He said they were in a state of panic, and he was afraid that the whole tribe was going to die out. You notice how few of them there are today? Didn't they make some sort of protest in the United States? One of the smallest tribes left, the Kootenays. He said he wanted to go across the mountain. Now, Canadian historians say, all right, if he wanted to go across the mountains to meet the Blackfeet, all he had to do was go across through the South Kootenay Pass and he'd be over here. That's what he did later when he started his St. Paul mission. Well, why in the name of heaven then would he go up the Kootenay and across the Whitman Pass and all the way over here past Drumheller, all the way up to Edmonton, all the way down to about Cowley, and then back home and that way again? If he wasn't looking for something to see if the British had any soldiers in there. I'm taking the side of the Canadian historians. Now, de Smet himself had no effect on what was happening. what was happening. But he said that he came through, and we call it the Whitman Pass today. It's called by the Geographic Survey from the Indians the pass where the white man placed the cross. And that's where the Smith put a cross at the summit of this pass. So we know it's the Whitman Pass, that the Indians called it. And but he said he came all the way down here in a very snowy winter and could find no trace of the Blackfeet whatsoever. Now, he must have gone right past them because they were there, and they always had been at High River. That big Spitzy post was there. It was there 50 years later. It had been there, how many years? 50 years before when Fidler was there. It was there 1804 when David Thompson was there, but he couldn't find them. And so this is the reason why we suspect Monsieur de Smet. I'll read what I have here about him. Sir James Henry Warr and Lieutenant M. Vavasseur were sent out on a secret mission to survey the Oregon Territory and determine whether the pass through to the Oregon Territory was in British territory or not. Their work was very valuable to the history of Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, and they did meet an American coming out in the opposite direction who wondered why 2 British officers were in his territory. And this American, as a matter of fact, de Smet writes down the name Warr as Ward, W-A-R-D, in his journal. And if you're interested, I was very interested in de Smet because he was the first man into the Crow's Nest Pass, and he mentioned the coal back there shortly after this time. That's, as a matter of fact, all his letters and accounts are in 4 volumes that were published in 1905 by Chittenden and Richardson. And but it says, the editors say that he went through the Vermilion Pass, but as I said, George Dawson said he went through the Whiteman Pass. He describes going to Rocky Mountain House. Now, when I tell you that it was almost impossible to trade at Chesterfield House and at Beaufort because of the hostility of the Indians, when de Smet describes Rocky Mountain House up here, I thought for a while it must be Beaufort the way he was describing it, because he said everybody is hemmed in there. There's a little tiny window through which they do their trading. And one of the things that amused me was the factor at Rocky Mountain House had a daughter. She had been a very bright girl, and she went out riding on the prairie one day and fell off her horse and hit her head. And from that time on, she was mentally defective. Well, when Father de Smet got there, she was pregnant. And when he asked the father about it, he said, well, I don't know, these things happen. There wasn't much he could do about it. Apparently, she hadn't done it herself. There was no claim of virgin birth or anything, but these things happen, is what the factor said. I hope all fathers are as understanding as that. But, it's pretty hard for me, because he describes a working coal mine, but he's not very specific. It might have been in Edmonton. Now, whether the Hudson Bay people were actually digging coal and using it, this is the only reference we have to it. Because there is coal, as you know, in Edmonton. Half of the hill on one side is still caving in. At least the houses on the top are finding that out. But our mine here was the first commercial mine, and that's the difference between the two. You know, when Fidler was going north, he found some coal. It's probably the same creek, because he records that he went down the Rosebud Creek. Fidler got some coal, and he brought it into the tent, and he used it for a fire. And the chief was very angry with him and ordered him out of the tent and wouldn't let him come into the tent for several days because he had broken one of their taboos. He must never burn rocks in teepees. Apparently they had some experience with it before. They probably had burnt some one day, and everybody in the teepee just kicked the buckets, and they blamed it on some unlucky factor other than carbon monoxide. Well, but it's interesting, if his people were so afraid of the Blackfeet, he also recounts that Little Robe's band of Blackfeet had been destroyed by the Crow Indians, and they had also inflicted a series of the Crees had also inflicted a series of damaging attacks upon them. So no one has given any logical explanation of why De Smet took the strange route he did. So maybe he was avowedly pro-American and wished to have something done before the British got ahead of him. The interesting thing was that he himself showed no fear of the Blackfeet and went in amongst them, and they treated him quite well when he met them at Edmonton, but he didn't meet the group that he'd set out to meet. Well, then he went south in the valleys along the eastern slope for about 300 miles. Now this would take him down between the Porcupines and the Livingston Range, just as Blackiston did later, so that on that snowy winter of 1845, we had a white visitor, at least in the Cowley-Lundbreck area. And here is something I'd like you to notice about Monsieur de Smet. This is his impression. I told you Fidler's impression of the prairies. You'll hear Palliser's if you haven't heard it already. Here's de Smet. This country would be capable of supporting a large population, and the soil is favorable for the produce of barley, corn, potatoes, peas, and beans, which grow here as well as in more southern countries. Are these vast and innumerable fields of hay forever destined to be consumed by fire or perish in the autumnal snows? Not so. The day will come when some laboring hand shall give them value. Jean de Smet, 1845. So quite a few fellows had a pretty good opinion of the prairies anyway. Now, I'll go on now to Palliser. Now, the interesting thing about this period of time, which is the 1850s and 60s now, was the great surge of the romantic, adventurous Englishmen going out suffering terrible, horrendous, horrible dangers and going back and writing about them and selling books by the thousands as bestsellers. As a matter of fact, in our library here we have one book which combines three of these accounts. Milton and Cheadle were two of them. They nearly starved to death. They very improvidently left Fort Edmonton without enough food, hoping to live off the land. Well, the land wasn't very living at the time they went through, and if it hadn't been for some Hudson Bay people, they would have starved. But that was all right. It added to the adventure and the thrill of the stories they wrote when they went back. I think of Cheadle every time I go up to Calgary, to Edmonton, you know. You go right past Cheadle. And that was named. I don't know if there's any place called Milton, but there is a place called Cheadle. It's like the Baroness Angela Burdett Coutts. There's no place called Angela as far as I know. That's the only thing they left out. But there is Baroness in Lethbridge. Three of the streets were named after her: Coutts Street, Burdett Street, and Baroness Road. Maybe we had one street called Angela. That was down on the point. Well, but these people were all the same. They all went that same route, the northern route. You can imagine how stunned people were when the CPR then suddenly decided that it was going across this way. And that had a tremendous influence on leftists. That sudden decision, the railway moguls decided to put the railway to the south, and of course it set Edmonton back on its heels for a long time. But we had hordes of people coming through that way. Lots of botanists, for instance. There was Douglas of Douglas fir. There's Nuttall of the violet Nuttall, and there's Persh. You see his name after about half the flowers in any book of Alberta, and a fellow named Drummond, Drummond's Dryas. And one of the amusing things, when I read their journals, I sent for their journals thinking I'd get some information on Alberta. And Douglas came through to Edmonton, and he had all his notes, but he had to go back to Oregon, and he was told that Drummond would be there shortly, and he was going back east, and he promised that he would take the stuff back. So you can imagine what Douglas felt like with all his new botanical information, giving it to another botanist, thinking, well, he might steal some of my thunder and name some of the plants after himself. But apparently, botanists are reasonably honest, and so Douglas's stuff got back, and the Douglas fir, which he called the Douglas pine, by the way, still carries his name. But a lot of those people went through. And every government sent out an explorer. The Northwest Territories government sent out one to explore. The Canadian government sent out one to explore. and the British government sent out one to explore. Now these three, that is Robertson Ross and Captain Butler and Palliser, the three of them. But where did the other two go? Up there. And Palliser came in here. So let's have a look at Mr. Palliser. And by this time, it's worth noting that they could come by train to Minneapolis. This is 1857 to 1860. They could take a stagecoach or a steamer. They took the coach from Minneapolis north to Fort Garry. He collected together all his equipment. They went westward. They brought the whole thing in to Fort Edmonton here. He got all his equipment there, left his men there, and then he went back east. And most of the time he skated down the river back to Fort Garry, and then went down to Minneapolis and spent the winter and came back out again in the spring. Now you compare that to the trek of the mounted police west, and you realize there's a slight difference in somebody who knows how to get around and some people who don't know how to get around. Well, Mr. Palliser was here, and he was here during the period. Now this is something else that I want to remember. The date I gave you was for Palliser was 1857 to 1860. Gold was discovered on the Fraser River in 1857. And between there and the time that British Columbia joined Canada, that's 1871, they had a chance to build roads. They built the Caribou Road. They built steamers, and every year the gold rush would go farther and farther and farther up. They'd have to build more roads and more steamers. And then all of a sudden, about 1870, the gold rush petered out, and there was British Columbia with hardly any people and lots of debts. So when the Canadians came along and said, well, if you join us, boys, we'll take over your debts. Well, no, that's worth thinking about, said the British Columbia people, and they did. So this is the period of the gold rush. And coming from here, Washington and Idaho here, the valleys, as you know, all run north and south in British Columbia, and people were coming up through here all over the place. And old Jimmy Douglas, he had a man there, and he had a man there, and he had a man there, and he said, you got a license, boys? You got this, boys? You're in British territory now, you know. And the famous gold commissioners popped up in British Columbia. So that on this side of the mountain, there was plenty of life going on. As a matter of fact, Wild Horse Creek, which is Fort Steele, it used to be called Stud Horse Creek, but that didn't sound elegant enough, so they changed it, was 1864. So you can see that as far as that side of the mountains are concerned, things were booming. It's only over here that, as a matter of fact, in 1864, Kootenai Brown was at Cranbrook, or the equivalent, and he decided to come out on the prairie, and he was told that if he went through that's through Waterton now, through the South Kootenai Pass, and then turned left, he would end up in Edmonton. He ended up in Saskatoon. He kind of missed the turn there, But this is the sort of thing that happened to the prairies. It was just a wild, open space. Now, so I want you to remember then that our period then, Palliser was in more or less of an empty country as far as white people were concerned. The Indians were here, don't worry about that. So Captain Palliser, with his cartographer, Dr., and he's a medical doctor too, Hector, and Lieutenant Blackiston are the three most vital people in our district, because they were sent out specifically by the British government to explore the area between the South Saskatchewan and the 49th parallel. So they were specifically south of the Saskatchewan River, and they had to get down to the 49th parallel. They were a little afraid of it. For some years previous, the Hudson Bay Company had been leasing an area known as Rupert's Land, and the British Parliament had been renewing this charter for 10-year periods. And the lease was up in 1858, and Canada was also becoming interested in the West. They wanted a new frontier. And so Britain wanted to explore a previously unknown area, and also to study the passes of the British Rockies as to their suitability for railroads. And this is the reason why these people went through all of these passes or mentioned them. Loaded with equipment, then, Palliser came by boat and by train to Minneapolis and then to Fort Garry. And from there, a party of 23 set out along a route calculated to bring them to the southern prairies. When I wrote this, I had to get this right from the journal. Mrs. Irene Spry has written a book now. I tangled with her about some of her interpretations, but didn't do any good. She doesn't believe me anyway. Women's lib, you know, and all that sort of stuff. Well, Palliser's search of the record showed that there were no journals of travel in this area. He didn't know about Fidler's journal, and neither does anybody else. So he had an odometer, one of those things that you stick on your leg, and as you walk along, it tells you how many miles an hour you're going. It's a speedometer with on your feet. And there's a story told that one of his half-breeds who was doing the measuring for him stopped off one night at a meeting of a half-breed dance, and by morning they found that his odometer showed 30 miles. It must have been quite a dance. That was the Red River Reel and a few things like that. But this is how he got his miles, and just about every record of latitude that he had was about 5 miles out. Every time he'd figure out the latitude and say, now I'm supposed to be by this river now. So he'd go on for 5 miles, and sure enough, there was a river. He always had to add another 5 miles to whatever maps he had of this part of the country. So he took weather records, he shot the latitude and calculated the longitudes, and made this wonderful statement: frost may occur any day in summer. That's not true, because in Coleman, between July the 1st and July the 2nd, there's never any frost. That's the summer. The rest of the time you're going to have frost. But we used to have snow in every month of the year. I think Lethbridge can. Well, we have that snow in July. Have we? Yeah. We have had it. Well, and we've got it for every month of the year. I remember it in June. But in Coleman, I can guarantee you, the Crow's Nest Pass, we had it every month of the year. We used to judge rainstorms by snow on the high peaks, snow on the low peaks, snow on the hills, snow in the valley. That was the different. I'd meet somebody in Edmonton when I was going to summer school. Has it been raining down there? Oh yeah, it's the snow on the low peaks. That's pretty bad. Well, this, of course, was not a true statement, because most of the period of the area over which he traveled was at least a 100-day frost-free period, at least according to the Department of Agriculture maps. And they never lie. They wouldn't think of it. Now, in the introduction to the report, Palliser seemed obsessed with the idea of the Great American Desert. And everybody in the United States had that idea. There was a great desert in the interior of the United States, and said Mr. Palliser, a small wedge of which protrudes into British territory. Every time he saw sagebrush, that's Artemisia tridentifolia, according to this book, and cactus, he said desert. It's rather interesting. When you read his journal, it's the most psychological journal I've ever read. Because the moment he hits the sandhills in Saskatchewan and starts moving across, he begins to lard his narrative with things like arid, parched, scorched, burnt, baked, all sorts of words, and you pretty soon you begin to sort of wipe them off your brow, because you must be in terrible country the way he has described it. However, he said there was a fertile area for about 20 miles east of Chief Mountain. He said it would be very good. Settlers could get along with the nutritious fish from the lakes, and with good grass they could feed the stock if they cut a little hay to carry them through the last part of the winter. He didn't winter in the Chinook Belt any time from 1857 to 1860, but Hector noted that the winter temperature was 15 degrees warmer in the south than it was in the north. Until they explored, they recognized only 4 passes as suitable for horses. They were the British Kootenai, that's the North Kootenai up the Castle River, the Vermilion, the Kicking Horse, and the Kananaskis. The first and last were best, but there was only 1 mountain to cross at Kootenai and 2 at Kananaskis. They noted that they didn't explore the pass with no mountain to go over. That was the Crow's Nest Pass. For the simple reason that somebody told them that it was a very bad road and seldom used. the only railway south of the Bow River, the only pass that's suitable for a railway, was the one they didn't go into. See, you've got to watch the Indians. When they say a pass isn't any good, they mean there's a lot of windfalls or something. They don't care whether it's high, low, or jack or the game, you know. As long as there's a good trail, they go. But railways, they want grades, and the Crow's Nest Pass had the grades, but they didn't know that. So they found the Middle Kootenai and the much-used South Kootenai Pass. And both Palliser and Blackiston crossed the North Kootenai. His last gloomy note in his introduction is that with the Crees friendly to the whites and the Blackfeet enemies of the Crees, the Blackfeet would never permit settlement. Besides, the astronomical boundary of 49 degrees north latitude isolates British American territory from Canada on the east and from the Pacific on the west forever. So don't you ever go to the coast because you're isolated forever. This is our friend Palliser. He based much of this on the fact that his half-breed guides were afraid of the Blackfeet. When he first started coming in, for example, they got to close to the Cypress Hills. Now that was Assiniboine country. And the closer they got to the Blackfeet, the more nervous his half-breeds got. And they wouldn't come any further. And he finally had to turn north and go up to Fort Edmonton that way. So that when he did come back down, he did it by going on the other side of the Porcupine Hills and staying close to the mountains so they wouldn't clash with the Blackfeet. Actually, though, now this is something that you wouldn't believe. Remember the old stories of some intrepid white doctor goes into some native village, black, blue, green, or something, and the chief's son is dying from a mysterious disease, and he performs an operation, and they live happily ever after. Well, you know, about 100 years ago, about the only operations they could perform were opening and closing. There was very little that they could do in those days, so the modern miraculous medicine wasn't even invented. But for some reason or other, at Rocky Mountain House, Dr. Hector was able to cure a chief's son. Now what he had, I don't know. Didn't say. But he got better. What did the doctor say? That 75% of all their cases get better without their help? So they got a 750 batting average to start with? Well, so maybe Hector was on his 750 batting average. But in any case, he did get along fairly well with some of the Blackfeet after that. Now, Palliser was rather lucky then because of Dr. Hector being a big medicine man. And he was also lucky because a group of Americans who had failed to get through the Rockies in 1859 and got their feet frozen and trying to get through to the coast, they were typical Americans, fearless and intrepid. So when the half-breeds wavered, well, he had the Americans to go along with him, and that gave him a little support. And if you notice, the interesting thing is that the factors of the Hudson Bay Companies, Brazeau, a very highly educated man with a knowledge of all the English, all the Indian languages, and most of the European languages, and Hardesty. It's rather interesting. This is 1857. In 1886, there was an election in Alberta between D.W. Davis and Factor Hardesty. D.W. Davis won. And a few months later, they decided that they should have a senator from Alberta. So Hardesty became the senator. So I guess by losing, he came out ahead because you don't have to work half as hard for the same money in the Senate. You know, have you seen it in the newspapers? Senate did not sit. What's it? Parliament today, House of Commons, a big list of what they did, and then Senate did not sit. And then they sit on the last afternoon and pass all the bills so they can get home or get back to the golf course. Now, but he knew that the Hudson Bay people had trouble with the Blackfeet because he mentioned Beaufort, which had only been 1 year and 5 months open altogether, and Chesterfield House, which had only been periodically opened in the early part of the century. So there was nothing there except Rocky Mountain House. Now the explorations of Palliser. They set out and met a party. Now this is something interesting. There's a contradiction here. Some books say that Lieutenant Blackiston was the first white man to cross the North Kootenai Pass. Well, in Palliser's report, he said they met a group of people who had gone to the Columbia Valley but returned because of a lack of good land and because their leader, Mr. Sinclair, had been killed by the Indians. They came back through the North Kootenai Pass and were led by a half-breed named Peter Whitford. There's a lot of Whitfords around Vegreville, Alberta. I think there's a little town next to Willingdon called Whitford. That was the Whitford family. But you notice that they came through the North Kootenai Pass. So it's the first time we have anything resembling settlers coming through our south country. The expedition took a new route, and it's rather interesting what the new route was, because it went through Fort Ellis, Turtle Mountain, Moose Mountain, and came to the creek, and he translated the Indian name of the creek as the creek before where the bones lie. You recognize that as Pile of Bones Creek, Wascana in Cree, with its more beautiful name of Regina. Pile of Bones is what the team looked like the other night when they were playing, living up to their name. But Wascana is much prettier than Pile of Bones, anyway. Now, when they got to Wascana Creek, then, the guides began to tell their stories of the Blackfeet, their atrocities, their ambushes. And they came to the edge of the Blackfoot country at Moose Jaw Creek, and they had a wonderful buffalo hunt there. As a matter of fact, the whole time they lived off the land, and only once or twice were they hungry, and never then were they in desperate straits. They came to the South Saskatchewan where the red deer comes in. Now that's close to Empress, Alberta, the site of old Fort Chesterfield. The half-breeds would go no further, so they turned north at the elbow of the South Saskatchewan and went to winter at Fort Carleton, which is between Prince Albert and Saskatoon, on the South Branch, as they call it, South Saskatchewan. And then, no sooner had they arrived than Palliser skipped back. He went to St. Paul, he went to Fort Garry, and he was back in Edmonton by spring. In the meantime, Hector had gone on to Fort Pitt and Edmonton, Lake St. Anne and Rocky Mountain House, and even into the mountains during the winter. This is Dr. Hector. He's the man who did all the maps. And it's interesting when you read the journals. Palliser's is the dullest writing. As a matter of fact, Blackiston's very interesting. And when you're reading Hector, you're not conscious of the prose at all. You just read what he says. It doesn't hit you between the eyes the way Palliser's did. So, the interesting thing about them, too, that all struck me when they came into this country, they never complained about cold. They never complained about difficult going. You know, the Hudson Bay Journal were full of, we spent many days crossing this portage, we had to pull our canoes on our backs, and we had to do this, and we had to do that. These fellows never complained about anything. We don't know how they were dressed, or how they slept, or anything else. Hector recorded a temperature of 47 below while they were camped on the trail at Rocky Mountain House. Now, in 1858, they went south along the Red Deer River, and they noted that there were coal beds, a fire there, which the Indians said had burned as long ago as they could remember. Well, they weren't burning when Fidler was there, and they weren't burning when DeSmith was there. So they must have started just in the few years before that. Well, then they swung west and came to a place where the trees stopped. Now, that would be somewhere around Innisfail. At least the trees come a little farther south now, or do they? It's hard to follow, like Fidler. He'll say, from here on, he comes down to a lone pine tree, and he said there was an immense plain, P-L-A-N-E. There were no trees at all, just asps and willows in the valleys. Asps meaning aspens. I thought they were snakes for a while there, but they were just aspens. So, then they moved south to a point 30 miles north of the Bow River, and they built a camp where they killed many buffalo, and this was called Slaughter Camp. Well, that should be around Crossfield, shouldn't it? Somewhere just north of Calgary. And then he decided to dash south to the 49th parallel. And here we have trouble with latitudes. He crossed the wide Bow River, and then he went south to a lovely spring in the Porcupine Hills at latitude 56. That's 50 degrees and 6 minutes. Now that's west of Nanton, isn't it? But the latitude he gives would put you in Claresholm. I wonder if we could start a feud between Nanton and Claresholm over where that spring was. But you know, Nanton gets its water from its fine spring. It's always amazed me that they never called it Palliser Spring, because he described it very definitely there. And then he crossed an unknown tributary of the Bow, which he called the Arrow. And when he told the Indians that he called it the Arrow because it went into the Bow, they thought it was very amusing and they laughed. The only trouble was, it was the Old Man River, and it didn't run into the Bow, it ran into the belly. But on Hector's maps, what do you find? The Arrow River, and then in brackets, Old Man River. So that's his Arrow. It had me puzzled for a long time until I was able to look at the maps. I couldn't figure out what this Arrow River was. So, and then he said we went south and crossed the Little Bow. Now he doesn't mention the Highwood River, and he went along the Porcupines afterwards, so it couldn't have been the Belly River. So we just have to guess what river he crossed. If the latitude were wrong, he could have been crossing at Okotoks, because he crossed the Little Belly without mentioning the Old Man, and this time he had 49 degrees 32 minutes. He was 37 miles north of the boundary at 113 degrees west. Now he could have been on our Belly River what's 30 minutes would be about 35 miles. He'd be about 35 miles north of the border at 113. Now Medicine, the boundary is 110. And the fourth meridian is by Cowley, so it's somewhere between McLeod and Cowley. You know, depending on you to know your latitudes and longitudes, you know that. 50th latitude runs right through Granum. Isn't that the line right north, just north of Granum? There's a line in the 50th latitude. The wind stops immediately when you cross the line there. You get down to the roaring 40s and it starts again. Well, then after crossing them, he said, I am the first man who ever stood here. Well, he didn't put it in those words. He said thus, I was most probably the only man who had ever been there. He stood on what he called a conical hill about 16 to 1,800 feet above the plain, a little north and east of Chief Mountain. Whereas I've known more people to guess where Observation Hill is than any mountain in the history of the world. Fraser Perry, that used to be on the Lethbridge Herald, thought he knew where it was, and I've been down there and I look at the hills and I don't see a conical hill that sticks up 16 or 1,800 feet, little to the north and east of Chief Mountain, because you run into a whole lot of hills there. So next time you go down that way, look for Observation Hill. It's isolated from the mountain, and it runs 16 to 1,800 feet above the plain. Now that should be somewhere south of Jefferson, I guess. Well, then he went back north. This time he was nearer the mountains, and he crossed the valley where there are sandstone cliffs 200 feet high in bizarre shapes and colors, including red. Sounds like Belly River Buttes. It's the only things that I know. And then he went north past Cowley and Pincher Creek between the Porcupines and the Livingston, past the three falls of the Bow River, and then went 4 miles up the Bow River to Old Bow Fort, which he gave as 51.9 latitude and 115.4 longitude. He then went down the Kananaskis River and over the Rockies, down the Kootenai, back over the North Kootenai Pass, or north across to the Highwood River, and back to Bow Fort again, to the circle all around, nearly becoming lost in a snowstorm. Hector, in the meantime, had gone over Vermilion Pass into Kootenai and back into Edmonton. So everybody was moving around. Notice I don't give you much about what happens in Edmonton and Calgary. See, I just tell you what's happening down here. It is worthy of note that the guides had to be paid in kind and paid at whatever post their contract ended. And their pay was figured at so many skins. You know, the made beaver, you see. And apparently their pay varied from 2 shillings to 2 shillings and threepence as a low one. But when they got down to Colville, that's in northern Washington now, they got 8 shillings and 4 pence. That'd be about $2, which is a lot of money. Colville is interesting. It's spelled today Colville, but the head of the Hudson Bay Company, after whom it was named, spelled his name Colville, no, only one L. And so if you're writing about the Fort Colville of the old times, it has one L, and if you're writing of the modern place, it has two. Well, finally then, in May 1859, they got permission to explore officially in Blackfoot territory. Most of their half-breeds deserted them in the Hand Hills, but Palliser still had his intrepid Americans with him, and so they ran into the Piegans. And it's interesting that every time he uses it, I said that nobody ever... Now, he went then into the Cypress Hills and he looked across at the mountains. He stood on the highest hill and he mourned that nothing stood between him and that 20-mile fertile strip but a wide tract of arid country. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is an eyewitness account of the land of the big sky and green acres, given by Mr. Palliser. You know, I was in, what was the name of the place? Boise, Idaho. And I'd driven across, you know, how desolate the country is. And in those days, this is 1929, there weren't very many irrigation situations then. I got to some little place and I said to one of the service stations, I said, how much of this damn desert is there still? And he looked at me and he said, well, if you prefer to call it desert, there's quite a bit. However, we prefer to call it semi-arid country, which blooms magnificently when irrigation water is put upon it. A service station operator again. So, maybe we should have had that service station operator down there when Palliser stood on his hill and looked across at Lethbridge. Well, he also saw the volcanic peaks to the south. He called them Les Trois Buttes. The three buttes, not three paps. Or, you know, I've got to find a Blackfoot and find out what the Indian word for that is. Because about half the mountains in North America are named after the mammillary form or other. Well, the party then divided, Hector going north and west and Palliser straight west. Hector crossed with ease where the Bow flows into the belly. In other words, he was at Bow Island, the island, straight north of Grassy Lake. He wasn't at Bow Island town, because Bow Island, the island in the river, is right at where the two rivers come together, straight north of Picture Butte. So that's where Hector crossed. And but 40 miles farther up, August the 7th, 1860, where would he be? Somewhere between Tabor and Lethbridge. Well, Palliser, to cross the river, needed rafts. Had to build rafts, and had to swim the horses across the river. Now, there aren't any trees at Tabor, are there, on the river? You noticed? When you cross to go to Brooks and that way, there's not a tree down in that valley. Now, where did the trees start?
They're at the pass west of Tabor.
West of Tabor, yeah.
Right.
Well, he must have crossed then, somewhere west of Tabor, between here and Tabor, where the banks were very steep. Because the trees, they'd have to have trees to make rafts. And I can assure you from other descriptions that I've had that there are no trees between here and Medicine Hat in those days, up on the bank. Well, he shot a buffalo, Dr. Hector did, 90 air miles from the Rockies and 145 degrees east of north of the Trois Buttes. Now that's at least Lethbridge, if not Lethbridge number 7, as I used to call it when I was a teacher. Well, they tried to dodge the Piegans, but had the same experience as Lewis and Clark, with their Piegans stealing their rifles and so on, but they didn't kill any, but managed just barely to save their equipment. Hector noted that there were sandstone clays with some lignite in them, so that if he could see coal, he probably was in this area. Now, he camped in hills at 50 degrees 13 minutes north. Which should be in the Picture Butte Barrens area. Doesn't that sound like the hills east of the Little Bow Park there, east of Vulcan? Because that's where they camped. There was plenty of rain, but the soil was barren and it ran off with no effect. Now this is something interesting. Everybody says that Palliser was here in a dry year, and that's what gave him his opinion of the West. And that somebody else was here in a wet year, and that was where he got his opinion. But this fellow said, the soil is so hard, there's plenty of rain here, but it seems to run off. And then later, McCown, whose autobiography I have on that list that I gave you, said that the reason why the water ran off was that there were so many prairie fires that the surface was almost baked. And he said that if the land were ever plowed, then it would be good and fertile. And I don't know how you do, but I dig my garden in the fall and just leave the lumps. But come spring, they're all broken up. You can bash them down with a feather almost. But you dig them up now and you can't bash them down with a sledge. And this is the type of land he was describing. So he said there was plenty of rain, but the soil was barren. Now this was in August. And then he went from the hills north through a swampy area, which could have been Lake McGregor, and he came out where the Highwood River flows into the Bow. And I've often noticed that. I used to have to fly to Edmonton or Calgary for the university at different times. And every time I crossed the place where the Highwood River comes into the Bow River, I always made a mental reservation, let me have a look at it again. Because Hector said, this is the most beautiful spot I have ever seen. And if you were flying over it now, when the trees are all golden in color, and then of course you have a lot, at that point there are a lot of spruce trees as well as poplars. And it is a very pretty place. As a matter of fact, when Fidler crossed there, a quarter of a mile above that, so I went down there to see it, and it is rather a pretty place. So if you ever happen to be flying over where the Highwood comes into the Bow, you'll know that that's where Dr. Hector said, it's the most beautiful spot I've ever seen. I'm sorry it's closer to Calgary than to Lethbridge, but I can't give you all the good tidings. So then he went on to Beaufort and over the mountains. Palliser left the Cypress Hills in 1860. They went along a long, deep, dry water course. Now it's either 40 Mile Coulee or Essakun Coulee, I'm not sure which the guide says drained into the Missouri. They crossed the Belly River at 49-47 north. That's 55 miles north of the border, about townships 9 and 10. He was very unimpressed by the country, so he headed west, south of the Porcupines. He crossed a tributary of the Belly, which was probably not a tributary of the Belly at all, but maybe the Old Man or the Pincher Creek. And then he headed again over the North Kootenai back into civilization, because I told you British Columbia by this time was teeming with people. Now, there was a gentleman along with him named Blackiston. And Mr. Blackiston had a quarrel. He was told that he had to do something, and Lieutenant Blackiston wasn't taking us all stuff, from Captain. So one of the most notable deficiencies in our library copy of the Palliser report was that it didn't contain the section known as further papers. And the further papers were written by Blackiston. He was later Captain Blackiston, and he's often referred to as Captain Blackiston in the report. He disagreed violently with Palliser over what his duties were, so he took over the work he was assigned to do and went off on his own. His work is extremely interesting and easy to read, as he has a much better narrative style than Palliser or even Hector. He added corroborated detail to an otherwise bald and uninteresting narrative, if I can misquote a famous pair of collaborators. His job was to locate passes and decide whether they would be suitable for railways. His men were afraid of the Blackfeet, so he came south between the Porcupine Hills and the Rockies, and that's actually the Livingston Range. He crossed the North Fork, as we used to call it, the Old Man, which he called the Belly, and then across the Middle Fork, which he called the Crow Nest River. And then he made an interesting observation. I want you to notice this, because he had just finished a long tirade on how unreliable these Indians were. He said, you get them away from their home base and they claim they know everything, and when they get there they don't know anything. They don't know where they are, they're lost half the time. And then the very next breath, the Indians told him that the Crow's Nest Pass wasn't any good, and he took their word for it. This is the interesting, he never went in there. But he said there is a trail coming from the plains up into this pass on the right bank of the river. So apparently it was used enough to have a trail. So he accepted the condemnation of the only pass in the south which would have been suitable for construction. He continued up the Castle River to the North Kootenai Pass. He described this very carefully, noting that a railway would be possible in the North Kootenai Pass if they fixed a stationary engine at the summit to pull the train up one side and lower it down the other. The height of the North Kootenai Pass is 7,000 feet. The Crow's Nest is about 44, 38, I think, depends on what map you look at. only the yellowhead is lower. What's the yellowhead? About 30, you know, offhand? Just a little over 3,000. And Banff, of course, it goes up over 5,000, the CPR of Banff. Now, one of the interesting things, the argument that I got into was with Mrs. Spry. See, as he comes down, you know, you realize I'm not giving you the whole Palliser report or anything like that, but as they come down, here's the Livingston Mountain, here's the gap in here, the North Fork, this is the Old Man River coming out here. And then you continue with the Livingston Range. Now, as they came down here, the Porcupine Hills are there, he looked through here and he saw a mountain which he called, it's had a perfect shape, and he named it after another English botanist. He had a thing about English botanists, fellow named Gold. And so he called it Gold's Dome. And now Gold's Dome is given to the next mountain, and this is called Tornado Mountain. Now something got mixed up in the meantime. So he said, it was a dome-shaped mountain, so I called it Gold's Dome. Well, he came south here, he's going into North Kootenai Pass, up the Castle River, and he looks north, and he sees a mountain. And the mountain, he said, I knew from its perfect dome shape that it was Gold's Dome. Well, if you ever go to Waterton, look north and look between the range and see a perfectly dome-shaped mountain, a beehive mountain, there's nothing but crow's nest. And Mrs. Spry still won't believe me. I said, well, come down and have a look. I was in Ottawa. I said, just come and have a look. You can't see that. He's about 30 miles farther south, and you can't see Tornado Mountain from there, but you can see Crow's Nest because it dominates it. So they never saw the Crow's Nest Mountain. And as a matter of fact, the Crow's Nest Pass, you see, took its name from a hill, not from a mountain. It's the pass is mentioned only here. And nobody went into the pass. He saw the mountain and described it and didn't recognize it. And yet on Hector's map, just inside the pass, there's a great big starred peak like this, and it's called the Crow's Nest. Now, it's too bad Hector wasn't here so we could ask him, how do you know it was there? I had a lot of trouble trying to find out how they got the name for Crow's Nest. I'll come to that when I get over that. And then I thought Crow Lodge. Well, that might be Crow Indians. So I looked it up. Crow Lodge comes from the Indian word meaning the lodge with pictures of crows on it. Masto, not Sappho. Well, so he returned to the southern end. He did a thorough job of exploring. He named Waterton after another English botanist. He named a brook after himself, Blackiston Brook. He named a mountain after himself, Mount Blackiston. Of course, he probably was like Governor Simcoe, who named Lake Simcoe not after himself, because that would have been immodest, but after his father, who happened to have the same name. So probably that's what he did. He named it after his father. But he was in our play area, but he never did turn his face to the plain. Palliser and Hector only were out on our plain. Palliser mustn't be condemned for his poor opinion of. He was so obsessed with the American desert idea anyway. But if we reduce the area that became his famous triangle, and reduce it, say, about like that, remember that now we have a dry farming technique that we didn't have 100 years ago, that we have crops that will ripen at least 10 or 15 days earlier than they would 100 years ago, and you still have a little piece that comes pretty close to being semi-arid, which would flourish if you put water on it, in the area around Suffield Medicine Hat. So he wasn't that wrong. But as I say, a lot of Americans had that same obsession. They didn't realize that there were whole sections, whole areas that were, well, like this area, the garden spot of America. As a matter of fact, do you know that the editor of the Lethbridge News used that? I was writing this down. I'm trying to keep ahead of you, you know, and I was writing it down today. Wonderful description that he made. I had it on tape, and you know, in Welsh we have a sort of thing that's called the hoyle, our preachers used to be seized by the Holy Ghost, and they'd go off, and their voices would go up, and they would talk so high, and they would build up to a great rank of enthusiasm. And I found that when I was reading this description of what a wonderful place this city of Lethbridge was, I found I was going off into one of these. So I didn't think I'd better play the tape for you, so I just decided to write it down and get it typed. Well, now there's only one other man that I haven't been able to track down. I've done a lot of reading, as you'd gather, of odd books at different times. But this fellow, I guess I'll have to try to track him down someday. He was in the West somewhere around 1751, at the same time as Henday was in the Red Deer area, the first man in that part of the country. And it's someone that I haven't run into, and he doesn't seem to have impinged upon any other writers of Alberta. De Niverville, and he was one of the French explorers. This is almost the time of the plaque. Now, the next section that I have to go into, this is what I should have done last time, let's finish this. I want to see if I've got them all now. Let's make sure that I'm finished here, because now I'm going into what happened next. Oh, I said I didn't have it. Cumulative Index, Glenbow Foundation. For instance, just about every article that's been in there, International Boundary Commission, Hudson Bay Company, about 15 articles. The Elbow River. Let's see if anything, yeah, about 10 articles on the Bow River and so on. I wonder if there's anything on the Belly River here. When we come around to this area, you'll have to remember that for a good long time, we had our nomenclature a little mixed up on the river. Blackiston, you notice, named the lakes Waterton Lakes, and yet they were known as Kootenai Lakes by the early settlers here, and the river was known as the Kootenai River. And when you read the magazines and the newspapers, you'll find that they continually use the term Kootenai. And that's why Kootenai Brown got his name. You see, he was with the Kootenays, and he was in the Kootenai Lake area and the Kootenai River. Well, they eventually found out that it had already been named, and so we have the Waterton River now and Waterton Lakes. Now, the whiskey traders now are the people that I have to come to. Now, this is where some of you have probably been as watered and as waterlogged as the whiskey itself, because I'm quite sure that you have heard more articles and so on. But the point to remember is that there was a period from 1865 onward when you have a war ending in the United States, which was probably one of the most disastrous war they've ever had from the number of killed. They had the largest armies that any group of people had ever had up to that time, and therefore there were plenty of people to go wandering around. Now you notice that Palliser found them wandering around between 1857 and 1860. Well, after the Civil War is over in 1865, you can imagine how many more there are. And when you also remember that just down here is a place that used to be called Fort Lewis. It's been there for a long time. It was changed to Fort Benson. And that it was the head of navigation on the Missouri River because they couldn't get past my Great Falls. The Great Falls here pretty well blocked navigation. So these people were here and were keeping a pretty accurate record. It was from here that the first man went up the Milk River and described writing on stone, for instance. Just wandering up the different branches of the rivers, and so we find the writing on stone was discovered by an American. And you notice that whenever anybody wanted to cross the South Kootenai Pass or the Boundary Pass or any other pass, they just went. Everybody seemed to know it. Well, you just have to remember that on this side of the line, things were happening. And things were also happening to our country in here. Let's look at the cast of characters and some of their posts before we start on the Indians themselves. First of all, they were big American trading companies in Montana. For instance, the I.G. Baker Company had a store in Lethbridge right down to 1891 when they sold out. They had a store in Calgary and they had a store in McLeod. They were a regular big business company. They were the people who had the bull teams, and William G. Conrad was another one. He wasn't immediately involved in the whiskey trade, but he was the man who became the chief shareholder in the American section of the line that was built from Lethbridge to Great Falls in 1891 or 1890. So these were big businessmen, and the men that came up, like the Hamiltons and the Healys and all the rest of them, were relatives of these fellows, and they were given that amount of information. And for instance, here I have Fort Hamilton, which later became known as Fort Whoopa, 1869. Healy, John Healy, Hamilton, Dave Akers. And years later, 1890, Dave Akers was still bringing cabbages in from Fort Whoopa to show what good cabbages he could grow, and taking them into the Lethbridge News office to show what a fine gardener he was. Still gardening in Fort Whoopa. Thomas C. Power. He was the man who owned big companies down in the United States. The Wolfers, who caused all the trouble to the Fort Whoopuppers, were his men. They were the ones up at Spitzy. And the Spitzy Cavalry, so-called, that were going to drive Healy and Hamilton out of the country, were Power's men. And J.B. Weatherwax, another company involved with the others in trading illegally in Canadian territory. I don't know how illegally you could put it, because they had a permit from the American government to, see if I can. I know which one I'm looking for now. I get these things all sorted out very carefully before I leave, and I can't find them when I get here. I've got it right here. That's one of the reasons why I couldn't find it. I was going to say, I'll have a look at some of the posts. Fort Hamilton at the junction of the Belly River and the St. Mary's. Fort Standoff, 1871. There was Dutch Fred Wachter, W. McLean, Mr. Juno, and Mr. John Liver-Eating Johnston. They were at the junction of the Belly and the Waterton River. That was Standoff in the original. Fort Kipp, 1870. Joe Kipp and Charles Thomas, where the Belly and the Old Man come together, was where they had their post. As a matter of fact, it was only about a couple of miles or a mile from where Halfway House was, the one that was featured in the newspaper the other day. Just about a mile below that. Slide Out, 1873, Mose Solomon and a man named Miller. It was halfway between Standoff and Fort Kipp. There was Spitzy Post, 1869, with Dave Akers and Liver-Eating Johnson, rebuilt for I.G. Baker in 1873. And the Elbow River Post in 1869, where H.A. Fred Knaus lived. I want you to remember this because there's an interesting item in the, it's probably, actually, if the name were spelled right, I suppose it's this name in German, Knaus. And Fred Knaus was a famous character because he had his name in the McLeod Gazette 3 times in 1 week. 1, a commendation from the editor for helping clean up the streets of dead cats and dogs that had been lying around all winter. 2, for clearing the streets during a flash flood so that the water could run off and without flooding the stores. And 3, he was arrested and fined for being caught in a gambling house in McLeod. So he really got to fame in that one day. Now, these are the same fellows who were in the whiskey posts. They stayed here, a lot of them. And, for instance, you know the Baring outfit, the banking company, a little item carried in the Lethbridge News says, Mr. Baring and his brother are out on a hunt in the Montana Territory. They have chosen as their guide a famous hunter named Joseph Kipp. So Joe Kipp is guiding the rich now for a living. This is the kind of job that he did. So a Conrad's post, 1871. Elbow post was at the confluence of the Bow and the Elbow, and Conrad's post, built by Charles Conrad, was 3 miles from Fort Kipp above the confluence. And then, you remember those. There are a lot of other posts. As a matter of fact, I wish Alex Johnston was here and he could speed them all off. I used to get him to come into my class when I was doing this in Western Canadian history, and he'd have his big card up with all the posts spotted, even those that were there temporarily, only there for a little while, and where they were. And you notice, everything is in the river valleys. All the explorers, they cross rivers, they mention camping at rivers, they stop at rivers, they talk about fording rivers, crossing rivers, and so on. But the moment the railway comes, after they've built the bridges across the rivers lose all meaning. And you could ask people how many times they cross a river between here and Edmonton, and even if they've gone up 50 times, I doubt whether they could get it exactly. You don't even notice them anymore. Whereas these old explorers would say, a middling wide river of about 15 yards at the center, obviously 30 yards at high water or something. This is the sort of description. Very good crossing here. There's a good crossing by Sharon's Mine. There's a good, but the hills are very steep. There's a good approach down below, but the ford is treacherous. Rivers, 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 all the time. As soon as we come up onto the plains, we forget all about them. We're back on the flat of the land, and we think in terms of going to McLeod and going to Claresholm and going to Picture Butte, going to Medicine Hat, over the top. We don't go down the river valleys anymore, and we lose track of them. And it's very difficult to get a good map with all the rivers on. And you notice here that every one of these was at some confluence. And I suppose there are good reasons for it, but they're not always very good. For instance, Pittsburgh is built like that. You know what happens to Pittsburgh every once in a while? What is it? What's the name of the rivers of Pittsburgh? They're funny names. I had them both memorized once. The Monongahela and something or other. Well, it's right there, and the Golden Triangle, all their fine buildings are in, and every once in a while the rivers rise and Pittsburgh's in the water. I suppose that's the only way they can really get clean. But it's simply built on an old post. These fur traders and so on, they wanted a place where rivers came together, and it was easier to defend an area like this, where you only had to put palisades up there, than it was to be out in the open. Now, why were we afraid of the Americans in this country? Well, I've already told you about Oregon. You come in, you outnumber the other fellows, you have a Democratic vote, and then you kick the other fellows out. Now, you know that in 1812, they nearly succeeded in doing that. When the new settlers from the United States, the late loyalists as they called them, wanted to vote to remain neutral while the United States attacked Canada. But General Brock said, no, boy, you're either going to fight or you're going to be dead. So they decided they'd fight, and they would declare war, and they did. Well, so that the Americans lost out that time. Now, the danger was getting less and less And our country certainly wasn't desirable stuff. There was no gold here, remember I told you? The land wasn't very good for farming on the old system and so on. But we were still scared that they would come in. After all, Mr. Douglas didn't put his gold commissioners on the creeks merely to raise money. He wanted to make sure that there wouldn't be another one of these down here. And he said, well, I think his statement was, I do not propose to see a Canadian debacle or something of that nature. Now, this is the flood and rule thing, and therefore we have to be watching the Americans. And if you think that this isn't important to Canadians, just wait till I get down, say, to the coming of the Mormons here, and into the great settlement after 1905. The Americans, farmers coming in here. There was a great fear all over the country. Newspapers were terrified that these Americans were going to come in and take over the land. And the closer you got to the Americans, the less the papers were worried. Lethbridge News wasn't worried. The Gazette wasn't worried. Calgary Herald was a little bit worried, but the Edmonton Journal was frightened to death. And the eastern newspapers, they were saying the Americans are taking over the country. But of course, in 1905, conditions were different. A lot of these people were leaving the United States because they were disgruntled. It's a different thing. And a lot of them were Canadians coming back, too. So we didn't have that same feeling. But the memory of the East, you know, the old United Empire loyalists, they don't forget. So they get scared every time Americans even cross here in numbers of more than 3. So the fact that, in spite of the fact that we have a myth of a lost lemon gold mine, there isn't any gold here, so we were lucky that way. If there had been gold here, I'm afraid we'd have been something like the Indians in the Black Hills. There's a fellow named Fraser who broadcasts in Calgary, and he always argues with me. He says, oh, if we had been ready to deal with the Blackfeet, we'd have done the same with them as we did with the Sioux. I said, what do you mean we did with the Sioux? The Sioux put up quite a kick. As a matter of fact, if you wanted to go back to Palliser, when he came north in the stagecoach from Minneapolis to Winnipeg, to Fort Garry, he stopped at a little place. The next time he went back there, that place had been destroyed by the Sioux outbreak in the 1850s. And he found the little doll that the little girl had been playing with. Well, one of these typical Victorian touches. Right there, the little girl had been killed. The whole family had been wiped out. So the Blackfeet could have been just as deadly. But he still argues with me, but that's all right. He likes to. Do you ever hear him, Bill Fraser? Is it on CBC Calgary? Very opinionated. So I don't mind clashing with him. I still think that... well, did you read the paper tonight? The letter from one of the Indian women? That's one of the most amazing letters. Only an Indian could say that. She said these people were going to go down to Ottawa and they were tying bombs to themselves and they were going to have all sorts of violence and they carried weapons with them. And then when the police tried 3 times to disperse them, they wouldn't go. Then when they use force, then they start to cry. And she suggests that maybe the press shouldn't give them so much publicity and pay more attention to the Indians who are minding their own business. The same pride is in our blood and Pecan and Cree Indians and Blackfeet Indians as in the old days. They still have that feeling of independence. I don't know what's going to happen. Reminds me of that movie, Tight Little Island. Do you remember that? What was it called? Whiskey Galore in England, where they had to capture the soldiers and tie them up. And the fellow said, oh, you're getting too rough. We don't want to be rough. You're going to hurt me. I mean, we want a rebellion there without hurting anybody. We want to seize the army, and so the fellow had to let himself be tied up without a struggle because they wanted to get this whiskey. Well, in any case, I guess I'd better move along. But the date of the writing on stone is 1855. James Doty is the name of the fellow. You know, it's an interesting thing. I've read a lot of Montana history, and in the interests of being a good neighbor, I wrote and got the 2 histories of the state of Montana and put them in our library at the university, and you know, I've never got around to reading them yet. Maybe I could find out a little more about Fort Benton. And it's interesting that there was a Fort Benton River Record was the name of the paper. And it was always being quoted. All the Canadian papers would quote from the River Record. And for a long time, I didn't know where the River Record was. I thought it was a Winnipeg paper. And then suddenly, one day they put in Benton River Record. Now, what happened that made it possible for the Americans to start trading in this area? Well, the answer, of course, is here. From here down, and there are descriptions of Canadian travelers who have gone down the Missouri River from Fort Benton on barges and all the rest of it. It's possible to use barges, and therefore the buffalo hide suddenly has a value. It was no good to the Hudson Bay people, because they had canoes, and canoes were fine for carrying furs, but canoes and York boats were no good for hides. Whereas these big barges could carry these hides down. There was a great demand for them. There was a development in machinery, and they used the buffalo hide for belts. A lot of the machine belts were made out of buffalo leather, apparently. And it wasn't that everybody was wearing leather coats or anything, but the demand became so great that people spent their lives doing nothing more than killing buffalo and skinning them. And as early as must be about 1850, when Francis Parkman rode his Oregon Trail, he describes crossing after the gold rush. He said that was 1849, and he said how they would shoot a buffalo. They would lie down on the bank and they would watch a buffalo graze, a buffalo bull, and they would wait until he moved the foot on the heart side forward, and then they'd shoot him there and kill him, and then cut off his tail as a souvenir. Now this is, you'll read it in Parkman's Oregon Trail. If you want, I'll have a copy of it. But he said this is the lazy man's way of hunting buffalo. But you know what it did. Now, our natives, of course, were pretty independent. For instance, the only Indians that Lewis and Clark clashed with, the whole trip they made right across to the coast and back, were our Piegans just on the Marias River. The only trouble they had with any Indian. So, well, what happened to them then, so that the white men could come in the way they did? And the Americans weren't the only ones. See, Mr. Gladstone was here. There's an interesting little item. Old Glad, as they called him, came into town, let's say 1890, to go east for the first time. I think he had come in the 1830s or 40s with the Hudson Bay Company, and he ran a sawmill, mountain mill, and he helped to build Fort Hoopa. And it said he had never seen a train before, and he was going back, I think he was going back to the old country, and he had to be shown how to get on the train. He didn't know what it was and how to get on it. This is within our history. Well, he was out here at this time. And as I told you, Kootenai Brown came through at that time. There were other people besides the Americans. But the question is, what happened to the Indians? Now, I have a list here of the things that weakened them. I was just going to look for the disease that struck them, how many of them there were. I have it written down here somewhere. I got it. Now, the Indians north of the Muddy River had been left on their own since David Thompson left them in 1800. But terrible diseases ravaged them. De Smet tells us that smallpox and scarlet fever hit them in 1845. Smallpox hit again in 1857 and 58. Measles took its toll, and it was a deadly disease for people like the Indians, in 1864. And they were hit again in 1869. Remember, that was the reason for our battle down here. The Crees thought that the Blackfeet would have been weakened because of the smallpox of 1869. If you go down to Bismarck, you cross the river into Mandan in South Dakota, they have a picture there that was painted by an artist of the Mandan Indians during a smallpox epidemic. And it shows a picture of the fort on the hill and the bodies that had been thrown out as they died, piled up on the hill, just helter-skelter. It's like a great big picnic of people lying around all over the place, in the half in and half out of the snow. This is the way that, and I'm sure you've all read stories of how the smallpox affected them. Now you add to that then a destruction of their morale, add to that the whiskey with which they were treated, and treated is about the only word, because they put all sorts of things in. You know, there's one thing the whiskey traders didn't think of. It took our Ukrainian settlers to think of that. You know, when I first went north, there was a whole gang of people, about 5 or 6, died as a result of a chram they had. There was a party that they had thrown. And they'd made moonshine. You see, they'd learned how to make moonshine whiskey, and it wasn't strong enough, so he put some formalin in it. Well, at least nobody did that to the Indians, so that they may have had tobacco and pepper and ink and all sorts of things in it, but nobody thought of formalin. I guess formaldehyde was too hard to get in those days. I was reading Kootenai Brown's description, he was a wolfer for a while, of how a bottle of strychnine was very expensive and they had to use it very carefully. And so when they were poisoning the wolves, 2 bottles would go for a big bull. And it had to be spread out and cut in a certain way, and then the poison would be soaked, and then they would put a flag or cloths around to scare the wolves away until the body froze. Because if it wasn't frozen, you see, one wolf could eat enough to kill 50, and they didn't want to waste the strychnine because it cost so much. And he told one fellow who had 150 dead wolves around one bull that he had poisoned in one night. But even the poison was very hard to get and very expensive. So that's why they put all these additives, like the gasoline companies do, to improve their whiskey, to give it better mileage and smoother running. But here is what happened. This is what Hugh Dempsey found, and he couldn't believe it when he saw it. December the 6th, 1869, permit issued by General Alfred Sully, Superintendent of Indian Affairs. This is Department of the Interior of the United States of America. Messrs. A.B. Hamilton and J.J. Healy of Montana Territory, having placed in my hands bonds and securities to the amount of $10,000, that they will not trade with any person, neither white man, Negro, nor Indian, in this territory after they leave Sun River Settlement. And I, being satisfied that said persons have no intention to infringe the laws regulating trade and intercourse with the Indians, are, by the direction of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs at Washington, permitted to pass through the Blackfoot country and cross the northern boundary of the United States at a point within 30 miles of St. Mary's Lake. They are also privileged to take with them 20 to 30 men and 6 wagons loaded with supplies, provided there is no spirituous liquors in the wagons except for a small quantity which may be taken safely for medicinal purposes. Can you imagine the nerve of Uncle Sam to give fellows permission to trade in a foreign country? Hugh Dempsey could hardly believe it. And most people, when they read this for the first time, say, no, that's not true. No, it was true. So that if you have pictures of whiskey traders with donkeys and barrels with X's on them and so on, you see you have the wrong idea. This was an organized expedition that came up to build Fort Whoopah. I wonder what would have happened to John A. MacDonald if he had known that. He probably would have stayed sober a whole week. Now, I don't want to go into too many shenanigans. I've got so much work to cover. But I'm sure if you read such books as Jerry Berry's Whoop Up Trail and Paul Sharp's Whoop Up Country and so on, you will get the picture of these whiskey traders and so on. But the important thing is that the Mounties were organized as a result of this. Now, I think I'd better quit. I don't want to get you too tired. And if I don't finish in the 5 weeks, I'll run another week. So that, now I want to start with the mounted police next day, their origin. I leave the trek out because Hamilton Junior High has been trekking away merrily and you can get all your dope from them. And then I'll come to the period in the mounted police between the time that they end their sort of frontier existence in 1885 with the Northwest Rebellion until the time when they become the police force of a settled territory. It's a very painful thing, and I nearly got scalped by the former president of the CPR for daring to make such terrible statements about such a fine police force. So I'm going to give it to you and let you judge for yourselves. Because there are many good things about the mounted police, and most of you know them. But some of the bad things that happened, I think maybe if I give you a few of them, you'll get a better appreciation of the men who stayed with it and did the good work that they did.